The spring wind carried the scent of lilac through the town square, though the sweetness could not disguise the bitterness of what unfolded there. Dust swirled at the feet of gathered townsfolk, their faces sharp with judgment, their voices lowered to a hungry hush. In the center stood a young woman, her back rigid though her frame trembled. Mei Lian clutched her two small daughters against her chest, the girls scarcely a year old, their round cheeks wet with tears. Her hair, once long and silken, lay in a heap at her feet, shorn away by the rough hands of her dead husband's kin. The men who had done it, Thomas and Clyde Hargrove, stepped back now with smirks twisted across their mouths. They were broad men, coarse with farm labor, their skin sun-cracked and their eyes lit with something meaner than the sun itself. One held the shears still glinting in his hand. The other spat in the dust and declared she was shamed, that she and her children bore the mark of disgrace. The babies, Lan and Hua, their tiny heads stripped bare, whimpered in confusion, their cries swallowed by the thick silence of onlookers. No one moved to stop it. The sheriff leaned on a post outside the saloon, arms folded, his jaw tight but his body still. Women on porches clutched shawls tighter around their shoulders, whispering to one another that it was a cruel thing, but what could be done? Men at the blacksmith shop crossed their arms, shaking their heads as though this were nothing more than a necessary correction. The town had drawn its line, and Mei Lian stood on the wrong side of it. Her husband, dead 2 winters past, had been a man without much tenderness. He had brought her west from San Francisco, a Chinese bride in a land that barely accepted her presence. When fever took him, the Hargrove brothers, his kin, claimed her fate as theirs to decide. To them, she was a burden, a woman too foreign to carry honor and too poor to stand alone. And so they shaved her head and her children's, leaving them bare before the whole settlement, as if to strip away not only hair but dignity itself. May's hands shook as she pulled her daughters closer, their small arms grasping at her neck. She did not cry, not where the crowd could see, but her dark eyes glistened as she stared at the dirt. Her lips pressed thin, refusing to beg. She was determined that if she was to be cast aside, she would not give the pleasure of her tears. Yet inside her chest, her heart pounded so violently it seemed it might burst free and collapse in the dust at her feet. Thomas raised his voice to the gathering. He said she was not fit to remain with decent folks, that she would find no roof under their protection. He called her a curse, a burden, a shame they would not carry. Clyde laughed and said perhaps some drifter might take her, though none with sense would choose a bald-headed woman with 2 squalling babes. The laughter spread thinly across the crowd, brittle and uneasy, for cruelty never sat fully comfortable even among those who tolerated it. Children in the crowd pressed against their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, staring at the twins who now resembled them only in form, their bare little scalps gleaming under the noon sun. May felt her own body tighten around them, as though her arms alone could shield them from the stares, the whispers, the hard truth of rejection. And then, movement. A tall figure stepped from the edges of the crowd. He was not one who often lingered in the square. His life was built of labor far beyond town limits. Javier Boone, 32 years of age, a rancher whose land stretched toward the river bend, walked forward with slow, unhurried strides. The dust seemed to bend away from his boots, the murmurs faltering as he passed. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with eyes the color of weathered stone, he carried no weapon in hand, no swagger in his gait, only steadiness. He came to stand before May. She lifted her gaze, startled, her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever stood between her and the contempt of others. Javier did not speak at once. His hand reached, not for the shears that still gleamed in Thomas's grasp, but for the bundle of cloth where one of the twins buried her tear-streaked face. His fingers brushed the child's back, firm yet careful, and then his eyes moved to May's. In that silence, the square seemed to shrink, the crowd dissolving into a blur of color and shadow. Only his eyes mattered. They did not glance at her shorn head, nor at the trembling curve of her shoulders. They held her, level and unashamed, as though she were whole, as though she were more than the cruelty done to her. Then his voice came, low and steady, carrying across the square like a slow bell. "You're coming with me." The words dropped heavy as stones, scattering whispers into gasps. Clyde stepped forward, protest rising in his throat, but Javier's gaze cut him down before the words could form. Thomas sneered, saying Javier was a fool to burden himself with a woman marked so plainly, But even his laughter sounded thin now. May's lips parted, but no sound emerged. For a fleeting moment she thought perhaps he mocked her too, that this was but another twist of cruelty. But the way he bent, lifting one twin into the crook of his arm with practiced strength, left no doubt. His other hand reached for the second child, who clung to May's torn dress. Gently, without haste, he gathered them both. Their small bodies quieted against him, as if some deep instinct recognized safety. May stood frozen, her arms suddenly emptied, her soul torn between disbelief and relief so fierce it frightened her. Javier looked at her again, not asking permission, not demanding trust, but offering it in the quiet steel of his presence. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward, her bare feet dragging through the dust until she reached his side. The crowd erupted then, voices rising, arguments flung like stones. They shouted that she did not belong, that he would regret this, that the town would not stand for it. But Javier did not turn back. With one child against his chest and another balanced securely in his arm, he moved, guiding May with the simple power of his stride. Sheriff Barrett shifted uneasily by the saloon post, his hand resting on his belt buckle, but he did not intervene. Perhaps he saw the futility, or perhaps he knew something of Javier's nature that the others forgot, that this was a man who did not bend once he had set his course. The spring wind carried petals from the lilac trees, scattering them over May's bowed head and the baby's gleaming scalps. She touched the place where her hair had been, feeling instead the brush of the petals, as if nature itself covered her shame with gentleness. The murmurs of the crowd followed them down the street, but Javier's silence was louder than all of it. They walked past the general store, past the blacksmith, past the gossiping porches, until the town fell behind them. May's breath came ragged, her heart unsure if it beat from terror or salvation. She dared one glance upward at the man beside her. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the horizon, yet in the firm line of his mouth she read something unexpected. Not pity, not pride, but resolve. Behind them, the Hargrove brothers cursed, their voices carried faintly on the breeze. The town murmured like restless cattle, already bristling at Javier's defiance. Trouble would follow. She knew it as surely as she knew the weight of her daughters in his arms. But in that moment, shame shifted inside her, loosening its grip. For the first time since the shears had cut through her hair, she felt a breath of dignity return, carried on the steady pace of his boots. The road out of town stretched long, the prairie grass swaying green in the warming air. May's bare feet stumbled on stones, but Javier slowed without looking at her, matching her steps as though he had always walked beside her. The children stirred, their cries softening into hiccups, lulled by the rhythm of his stride. May pressed her hands together before her chest, unsure if she prayed or simply steadied herself. She had been cast out, stripped of all she thought she was, and yet this stranger gathered her up without question. Her mind reeled with fear, of what he wanted, of what the town would do, of what awaited beyond this moment. But her heart, weary and battered, clung to the only truth it felt, that she was not alone in the dust anymore. The horizon glowed gold with the promise of sunset. Javier stopped once, turning to look back toward the cluster of buildings that had condemned her. His eyes narrowed, reading the shapes of men still lingering there, watching, muttering. Then he shifted the children higher against his chest and resumed his walk. May swallowed hard, her throat dry. She did not know his reasons, nor what lay ahead, but she knew one thing as the town faded behind them. Her life had changed in the span of a single breath. And as they stepped onto the open road, the murmur of voices carried faint on the wind, a warning and a promise both, that this act of defiance was only the beginning. Javier's shadow fell long beside hers in the evening light, the twins' heads resting against him as though he had always been their shelter. May dared to lift her face fully now, the petals still caught in the curve of her scarf, and for the first time she felt the stir of something fragile yet unbroken. It was not safety, not yet. Nor was it peace. It was the spark of a story that had only just begun, and though her heart trembled, she stepped forward with him into the uncertain dusk. And when the last sound of the crowd faded behind them, Javier Boone, with a weight of defiance and mercy both upon his shoulders, whispered words she alone could hear, words that sealed the course of all that was to come. "You're mine to protect now." The prairie stretched wide and open, green shoots lifting toward the sun, the sky pale with the promise of another gentle spring day. Javier Boone's cabin stood on a low rise beyond the river bend, weathered but sturdy, its roof patched with new shingles, its porch swept clean as if waiting for something more than a man's solitude. When he guided Mei Lian and her 2 daughters across the threshold, silence hung between them like a fragile veil. The babies clung to her skirts, their small bare heads shining in the lamplight, their eyes darting across the unfamiliar room with a mix of wonder and unease. Javier placed a kettle over the fire, his movements slow, deliberate, as though not to startle her. He did not ask questions about what had been done to her in town, nor did he mention the murmurs that would already be spreading from porch to porch. He simply ladled warm water into a basin and set it before her on the rough-hewn table. She hesitated, fingers tightening on the worn cloth at her waist, then lowered herself onto the bench. The steam rose to meet her face, and for the first time that day, her body eased just enough to release a breath she had been holding since the shears cut through her hair. Her daughters, Lan and Hua, toddled unsteadily across the plank floor. One reached for the legs of Javier's chair, gripping it with chubby hands, while the other pressed her forehead against her mother's knee. May gathered them close, whispering words soft and lilting, syllables that Javier could not understand but which calmed the little ones until their sobs slowed to hiccups. He listened without turning his head, as though her voice was music too private to stare at directly. The hours stretched quiet. May studied the cabin, noting the neatly stacked wood by the hearth, the plain bed tucked in the corner, the shelves holding jars of beans and flour. No woman's touch had softened the space, yet it bore no neglect either. Everything was orderly, functional, tended with care. She wondered what it meant for a man to live alone in such silence, with no children's laughter, no second voice to share the burdens of the seasons. When Javier finally spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant, as though the stillness itself demanded respect. "You'll sleep here." He gestured toward the bed. "I'll take the floor." May shook her head quickly, words tumbling in her own tongue before she caught herself. She pressed her lips tight, then whispered in halting English, "No. Children, floor." Her hands clutched the fabric of her skirt, ashamed of her broken speech. But Javier only set down another quilt on the boards near the hearth and shook his head once. "Bed's yours." No argument in his tone, no expectation either. Just fact, solid as stone. That night she lay stiff upon the mattress, her daughters curled against her sides. The firelight cast long shadows across the beams, and through the crack of her lashes she saw Javier stretched on the floor with his arm draped across his chest. His breathing was steady, untroubled, and for reasons she could not name, she felt safer with that sound than she had in many years. Still, her fingers brushed the smooth skin of her shorn head, and tears slipped silently into the pillow. Morning light poured through the window, scattering gold across the room. Javier was already outside, his figure outlined against the open pasture. May watched from the doorway as he worked, his broad back bent to mend a fence rail, his movements unhurried but precise. He did not look back at her, yet somehow she felt he knew she stood there, and that he allowed her the dignity of deciding whether to step forward or retreat. She chose forward. The damp earth clung to her feet as she crossed the yard, Lan tugging at her skirt while Hua toddled behind. Javier straightened, dusting his palms, and handed her a coil of twine. She blinked at it, uncertain. He knelt then, guiding her fingers to the splintered wood, showing her how to tie the knot firm enough to hold but not so tight it would snap. She listened carefully, repeating his motions, her eyes narrowing in concentration. When the fence stood straight again, Javier gave one short nod, the smallest of acknowledgments, yet it sent a warmth through her chest. Later, when she boiled rice over the stove from the small pouch she had carried all the way west, Javier ate without complaint though the grains were plain and few. He did not remark on the taste, nor on the way she bowed her head while serving. When he refilled her daughter's bowls before his own, May's throat tightened, though she said nothing. Days passed in this rhythm, unspoken yet steady. May swept the cabin floor, patched a tear in his shirt with careful stitches, and washed the children's clothes by the creek. Javier hauled water, chopped wood, and returned from town with sacks heavier than usual, though he never said what gossip he endured there. Sometimes, when dusk softened the fields, he showed her how to coax seedlings from the soil, his hands cupping hers as he pressed corn into the earth. She felt the roughness of his palms, the steadiness of his touch, and though he released her quickly, the imprint lingered long after. But the world beyond the river bend was not so quiet. One afternoon, Mrs. Callahan rode up, her bonnet shadowing a face lined with both kindness and worry. She dismounted, eyes sweeping from May's bowed head to the twins chasing one another in the grass. Javier met her at the gate. "Folks are talking," she said softly. "Some don't take kindly. You ought to be careful." Javier only inclined his head, his jaw tightening, but May felt the weight of those words settle in her stomach like stones. That night, she asked him in her broken English, "Why help?" Her eyes searched his face, fearful of the answer. Javier looked at her for a long moment, then set aside the knife he had been sharpening. His reply came slow, simple, because no one else would. And then he turned back to his task, leaving her to wrestle with the meaning. The first sign of malice came under moonlight. A stone shattered the window, scattering glass across the floor where the twins had been sleeping moments before. They woke shrieking, clinging to their mother as she gathered them against her chest. May's pulse thundered with terror. Javier strode to the doorway, rifle in hand, his figure framed by the glow of the fire. Outside, the night was empty but for the rustle of leaves, the guilty silence of retreating footsteps. He stood there long after, his shoulders rigid, until the sky lightened at the edges of dawn. In the days that followed, May could not shake the fear. She tied her scarf tighter around her head, ashamed of her naked scalp, ashamed too of the way she trembled when her daughters cried. But Javier never spoke of the stone, never asked her to leave. Instead, he worked beside her as though nothing had changed, though his rifle now leaned against the cabin door by night. Once, while gathering water, she caught her reflection in the creek. Her scarf had slipped, revealing the cruel baldness that marked her shame. Tears pricked her eyes. Behind her, Javier approached quietly, setting down the pail. His gaze touched her exposed head, then rose to meet her eyes. He said nothing, only bent to fill the bucket, and in that silence she felt a strange mercy. He had seen her shame, and yet he looked through it as though it did not exist. Lon and Hua began to laugh again, their tiny feet pattering across the porch, their voices ringing bright against the hills. They clambered onto Javier's boots, gripping his legs as though he were a tree, and he allowed it, lifting them onto his shoulders one by one. May watched, her heart swelling with both joy and dread. For each smile they shared here was a debt owed to the scorn of town. For each kindness Javier gave, the world outside sharpened its knives. One evening, after a meal of beans and cornbread, May whispered her thanks, her voice breaking. Javier looked at her across the table, his expression unreadable, and answered only, "You owe me nothing." Yet the words wrapped around her like a blanket, though she feared their warmth could not last. The wind shifted as spring deepened. Clouds gathered heavy with rain, and whispers in town gathered heavy with threat. At the general store, men muttered that Javier had gone soft, that he was a fool for sheltering the shamed widow. The sheriff warned him quietly that patience was thin, that some talked of taking matters into their own hands. Javier listened, stone-faced, then loaded his wagon with supplies and drove back without a word. That night, the air carried a charge like lightning waiting to strike. May laid her daughters down, smoothing their blankets, her heart tight with foreboding. Through the crack in the door she watched Javier sit on the porch, sharpening his axe, his face set against the fading light. The rhythm of the blade against stone echoed steady, unyielding. She wrapped her arms around herself, the scarf slipping loose, and wondered if he knew what storm was coming. She wondered too if he regretted the choice he had made, lifting her from the dust when all others turned away. But when he rose, setting the sharpened axe aside, he glanced once toward the cabin window. His gaze caught hers through the dimness, and in that moment she understood, regret was not in him. The night deepened, the twins stirred in their sleep, and May pressed her back to the wall, listening to the sound of Javier moving about outside, guarding against shadows. Her heart beat in a rhythm of fear and fragile hope, for she knew the town's patience was near breaking. And when the wind rose, rattling the shutters, and the firelight flickered across the rifle leaning by the door, she felt in her bones that the true test of this shelter had yet to come. Spring ripened into fullness, the fields beyond Javier Boone's cabin shimmering green under the wide blue vault of sky. Morning mist rose from the river and drifted across the pastures, softening the world until it seemed touched by some gentle hand. Mei Lian stood at the edge of the porch with her daughters clinging to her skirts, watching as Javier led his mare to water. The children's bald heads gleamed in the sun, yet already a thin fuzz of hair showed, stubborn proof that what had been taken would grow again. Mei tied her scarf tighter, though. The memory of the shears still pressed against her skull like a phantom blade. She carried shame the way others carried scars. Visible or not, it weighed the same. But the longer she remained here, the more that shame began to loosen, thread by thread, as Javier's silent steadiness wove something new around her. He returned from the river with sleeves rolled, water dripping down his forearms. When Lan toddled toward him with arms outstretched, he bent without hesitation, scooping her onto his hip. Hua followed, tugging at his trousers until he lifted her too, balancing both as though born to it. Mei watched, caught between relief and something deeper she dared not name. The twins laughed so loudly their voices carried to the hills, and she wondered if the land itself leaned in to hear. In town, whispers sharpened with every passing day. Mrs. Callahan rode by often, bringing eggs or gossip wrapped in cautious words. She warned Mei quietly, her weathered hand pressing against hers for a moment of solidarity, that petitions were being passed, names gathered to see her gone. Mei bowed her head, feeling the old heat of shame rise again, but Javier's voice cut through when he said plainly, "Let them talk." His calm was a stone wall, unmoved by the storm beating against it. Each day carved its own rhythm, shared tasks shaping an unspoken bond. Javier showed Mei how to plant corn in neat rows, his large hands guiding hers in the soil. When she tried alone, her lines wavered crooked, and she laughed softly in embarrassment. He said nothing, only bent to straighten them, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. She cooked rice with wild onions she had gathered by the creek. He ate with a quiet gratitude that made her chest ache. One evening he returned with a broken rocking chair salvaged from the barn. Mei tilted her head in confusion as he knelt with tools spread across the floor. The twins perched nearby, giggling as they tried to hand him nails. Slowly, with care that seemed almost tender, he mended the joints until the chair stood solid again. He placed it before the hearth, gesturing for her to sit. When she did, rocking gently with Lan in her arms, tears sprang unbidden. She whispered a thank you in her own tongue, voice trembling. Javier only nodded once, eyes resting on the fire. Later, she tried to give back what little she could. She embroidered his initials, clumsy, uneven stitches, into a square of cloth and set it folded on the table. When he found it, he looked at her across the room, something unreadable in his gaze. He placed the cloth carefully into his pocket, as though it were worth more than gold. The bond deepened not with grand gestures but with silences filled by presence. When Mei's scarf slipped one afternoon as she carried water, exposing the cruel baldness beneath, her breath caught in panic. But Javier reached gently, tucking the fabric back with a touch so respectful it made her knees weak. She turned away quickly, tears burning her eyes, yet in that moment something shifted. Her shame no longer felt like hers alone to bear. The twins were the first to bridge the last gap. At dusk they clambered across the floor toward Javier, their tiny voices piping out a word Mei had never taught them. "Baba." "Father." She gasped, heart leaping, ashamed that they had thrust such a name upon him. She reached to silence them, but Javier only stilled, his large hands frozen mid-motion. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to his knees, letting them crawl into his arms. He did not correct them. His eyes lifted to Mei's, steady and certain, and though no words passed, the air between them filled with something vast and unspoken. But shadows lengthened too. At the general store, Javier faced three men who muttered about his foolishness, their laughter hard-edged. One spat near his boots. Javier did not reply. He stood taller, shoulders squared, and their words withered against his silence. Still, when he returned that evening, there was a tightness in his jaw, a watchfulness in his eyes. Mei sensed it in the way he lingered on the porch after dark, the rifle resting across his knees. She sensed it too in her own chest, where dread coiled like smoke. The kindness blossoming between them was fragile, delicate as spring buds, yet the weight of town's disapproval threatened to crush it before it flowered fully. She told herself not to hope, not to imagine more than what was. Yet hope grew regardless, fed by the smallest things. The way he poured water for her before filling his own cup, the way his eyes softened when the twins tugged at his beard, the way he walked beside her without hurry as she carried baskets of laundry to the creek. These were not the acts of a man pitying her. They were the acts of a man who saw her. One night, while the children slept, she sat by the fire mending his shirt. The light flickered across her hands, tracing the delicate curve of her fingers against the rough fabric. Javier watched silently from the other chair. When she pricked her finger on the needle, she gasped softly. He reached for her hand without thought, taking it in his calloused palm. His thumb brushed the small bead of blood. Their eyes met, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then he released her gently, as though aware of the precipice between them. She returned to her stitching, though her hands trembled. The next morning, Mrs. Callahan rode by again. Her voice was sharper now, the weight of town opinion pressing on her. "They're gathering at the hall, Javier," she said, talking about forcing her out. Javier's jaw clenched, his silence carrying more power than any reply. May stood in the doorway, heart pounding, knowing the tide was rising against them. That night Javier worked long after sundown, sharpening fence posts, stacking wood with restless energy. May laid the twins to bed, their small breaths even and soft. She stepped outside into the cool air, her scarf fluttering in the wind. Javier looked up, sweat glistening on his brow, axe steady in his hands. For a moment she saw not just the man who had rescued her from shame, but the man who now carried her fate upon his shoulders. Her voice broke the silence. "You no regret?" Her English faltered, but her meaning was clear. Javier lowered the axe slowly, meeting her gaze in the starlight. His answer came steady. "Not once." The words struck her deeper than any kindness before. Not once. No hesitation, no apology, only truth. She felt the sting of tears, but this time they did not fall from shame. Days passed, each heavier with tension. The twins laughed and played, unaware of the storm gathering. May tried to hold to those moments. Hua chasing butterflies in the field, lawn collapsing in giggles when Javier lifted her high into the air. The world narrowed to these glimpses of peace, fragile yet radiant, while beyond the river the town sharpened its knives. One evening, clouds gathered thick, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Javier sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, the whetstone rasping against the blade of his knife. May watched through the window, her daughters curled in sleep, and felt her pulse quicken. The night carried an edge, the kind that came before lightning split the sky. She wrapped her scarf tighter, pressed her palm to the wall for steadiness, and understood that shelter could only hold so long against the fury of men. The twins stirred restlessly, murmuring in dreams, and May bent to soothe them. When she straightened, she saw Javier still outside, his figure a dark sentinel against the storm clouds. His eyes scanned the horizon, as though expecting shadows to emerge at any moment. Her heart thudded. She thought of the petitions, the whispers, the stone that had shattered their window. She thought of the cruel laughter in the square when her hair fell to the dust. And then she thought of Javier's words, "Not once," and felt both terror and resolve braid together inside her. The sky growled low, thunder rolling across the hills. Javier rose slowly, setting aside the whetstone, the knife gleaming sharp in the dim light. He lifted the rifle, checking its weight with calm precision. May pressed her daughters closer, breath-catching. She knew without needing to be told. The town was coming. Rain had not yet fallen, but the air trembled with the weight of it, the sky swollen and gray as if the heavens themselves held their breath. The prairie bent low in the rising wind, grasses whispering of a storm that was more than weather. Mei Lian stood at the window with her daughters sleeping close at her skirts, their tiny breaths soft against the hush. Beyond the porch, Javier Boone stood tall, the rifle balanced in his arms, his face calm as carved stone. She had seen him mend fences, lift burdens, coax seed from earth, but never had she seen him like this, every line of him taut with quiet readiness, as if the land itself had forged him for this moment. The sound came first like a rumble of distant thunder, hooves and boots, men gathering in anger. From the bend of the road, shadows formed into figures. The sheriff's broad hat tilted low, his voice carried rough by the wind as he called for Javier to step forward. Behind him, a cluster of townsfolk shifted, some clutching lanterns, others iron tools, and at the center the Hargrove brothers stood with sneers curling their lips, their hatred sharp as knives. Javier did not move. He rested the rifle against the porch beam and folded his arms, letting the silence stretch until even the crickets stilled. The sheriff cleared his throat, louder this time, saying they had come for the woman, that the people would not abide her presence, that Javier was defying the will of the town. Inside, May clutched the edge of the table, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might rattle the windows. Her daughters stirred in their sleep, sensing the shift, whimpering faintly before settling again. She looked to Javier, searching his face for fear, for doubt, but found none. Only a stillness deeper than the storm pressing at the horizon. He spoke at last, his voice carrying steady as a church bell. "You'll not lay a hand on them. Not now, not ever." The words cracked across the crowd, drawing murmurs, some uneasy, others mocking. Thomas Hargrove spat into the dirt, shouting that Javier had been bewitched, that no decent man would ruin himself for a shamed foreigner. Clyde raised his fist, calling for her to be dragged out and sent down the road where she belonged. Before Javier could reply, May stepped to the doorway, her scarf trembling loose in the wind. She could have hidden, could have cowered behind the man who had chosen her fate, but something stronger rose in her chest. She pulled the scarf away, letting the wind touch the bare scalp the brothers had left her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some turned their faces, others leaned forward hungrily for spectacle, but May's eyes found Javier's, steady and unshaken. Then she lifted her chin and spoke in broken yet firm English, each word carved with the weight of her soul. "I am not ashamed. My children will not live in fear." The Hargroves laughed, but the sound faltered. For in her voice there was no begging, no plea, only defiance rooted in pain turned to steel. The sheriff's hand shifted at his belt, fingers brushing the holster, but he did not draw. His eyes flicked between Javier and May, something like hesitation creeping into his stance. Javier stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the damp earth, his frame casting long shadows in the lantern light. He faced the men, his rifle easy at his side, his jaw firm. "You want a fight, you'll have to go through me." His voice did not rise, but its calm struck harder than any shout. The townsfolk wavered, eyes darting. A few shifted uneasily, muttering that this had gone far enough, that blood was not worth spilling for pride. Mrs. Callahan, drawn by the noise, pushed her way through, her bonnet blown back by the wind. She planted herself between Javier and the sheriff, her voice sharp with unexpected fire. "Enough. This woman has harmed no one. These children laugh like any others. Shame on you all for chasing cruelty where kindness should be." Her words carried weight, more than she likely knew, for they cracked the crowd's unity. Murmurs rose, some in agreement, others in protest, the storm of human judgment turning uncertain. The Hargrove brothers shouted louder, trying to drown it, but even their venom seemed less sure against the sight of May standing unbowed and Javier towering beside her. The first drops of rain fell, splattering into dust that hissed as it drank. Thunder rolled closer, shaking the ground beneath their feet. In that moment the sheriff raised his hands, palm outward. "No blood tonight," he said gruffly, though his eyes flicked with unease. "Let it rest." He turned his horse, and though the Hargroves cursed and spat, the crowd began to thin, lanterns bobbing away into the dark. Silence settled heavy in their wake, broken only by the patter of rain growing steady. May swayed where she stood, breath trembling, the scarf still clutched in her hand. Javier returned to the porch, the storm wetting his hair, his shoulders dark with rain. He looked at her not as a man victorious, but as a man certain of what he would do again, and again, without question. She stepped forward, her daughters rousing and clinging to her legs, their eyes wide with sleep and confusion. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, Javier knelt in the mud before her, the rifle resting forgotten at his side. He looked up at her as though she were the only light left in the storm, and his voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her. "I loved you the first moment I saw you. Not for pity, not for need, but for the fire you carry." May's breath caught, tears spilling freely now, washed by the rain that streaked her face. She lowered herself until her forehead touched his, the children pressing between them, and in that closeness she felt the shame of her past dissolve into something stronger than she had ever dared dream. The rain poured harder, drumming on the roof, splashing into puddles that mirrored the lantern light fading in the distance. Javier rose, lifting both daughters easily into his arms, their small faces lit with the wonder of storm. May followed him inside, the door closing on the darkness behind them. By the hearth, the fire crackled bright against the sound of rain. May wrapped the scarf not around her head but around her daughters, pulling them close. Javier set down his rifle, the weight of the night finally falling from his shoulders, and looked at her as if the storm outside no longer mattered. She met his gaze, unflinching, her voice steady for the first time since she had been cast out. "You give us home." Her words, halting yet clear, filled the cabin with warmth brighter than fire. Outside, the storm raged, but within the cabin spring had come. It bloomed not in flowers or grass, but in the courage of a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, and the steadfast love of a man who had chosen her against the world. And yet, in the hush that followed, with the twins drifting back into slumber and the storm pressing close against the walls, May's heart whispered a truth she could not ignore. The town's anger had not died, only retreated. This night had been won, but the future lay uncertain, fragile as the petals that once scattered in the dust of her shame. She pressed her daughters closer, listening to the rain and the steady rhythm of Javier's breath beside her, and knew that whatever came, she would not face it alone.